In the afternoon, Emily went over to see John at Smokies. John had been busy all morning, and was feeling tired by the events from the previous night. But there was something still racing around his mind. He wanted to know who Joe was, and why he was here. Nobody knew of Joe, until the last night. As he finished cleaning the coffee bar, the doorbell rang. It was Emily, standing with a homemade meal for the two of them. "I've made this for you and I to share," she said, as she placed it down on a table next to the open fireplace. "Thank you," John replied. John went into the kitchen, and grabbed some cutlery for the two of them, and sat down opposite Emily, who was now sitting, waiting on John. They both looked into each other's eyes. John smiled at Emily, not saying a word, and Emily smiled back. "I have a feeling this isn't over yet," John expressed to Emily. "I know," Emily replied. The young woman, who they now know as Evelyn Parker. They found out about Evelyn. She was a spirited young woman in her early 30s who had lived a solitary life in the quaint coastal town of Harbour's Edge. She moved to the cottage in the outskirts of Oakridge Forest many years ago. With her fiery auburn hair and eyes that held the secrets of the sea, she was a striking presence in the community. Her last name, Parker, carried the weight of generations who had weathered the storms and reveled in the bounties of the ocean. For years, Evelyn had been content living alone in a cozy cottage in the outskirts of Oakridge Forest. She spent her days tending to her garden and her evenings at the town's beloved pub, Sailor's Haven, where she worked as a barmaid. The pub was a gathering place for the hard-working fishermen who cast their nets into the deep waters and the weary travelers passing through on their way to the mainland. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow on the water, Joe walked into Sailor's Haven. He was a ruggedly handsome man in his 30s, with black hair and had an unshaved look that hinted at the stories he carried. Their connection was immediate, like the ebb and flow of the tide. Joe became a regular at the pub, not for the drinks but for the chance to spend time with Evelyn. They shared stories of their lives, dreams, and the mysteries of the ocean that bound their souls. Evelyn's life transformed with Joe's presence. The solitude that once comforted her was replaced by a newfound warmth. Together, they explored the rugged cliffs, ventured into the woods to forage for wild herbs, and danced under the starry night sky on the beach. Evelyn found herself falling deeply in love, her heart intertwined with Joe's. As their love story unfolded against the backdrop of a town where the sea and the mainland met, it became a testament to the timeless power of connection. Evelyn, once a solitary soul, now knew that she had found her anchor in the arms of Joe, a man whose love was as boundless as the ocean itself. But something was not right. Joe would disappear for days, not saying where or who he was with, or doing. Things changed between them, and as time went on, it went from good to worse. Joe was in this deeper than the young woman knew. He had a dark, deep secret he was about to share. He was influenced by a Ouija board. It had taken over his life. In fact, it was now his life. He had lost control, and was now totally out of control by his actions and thoughts. His aim was set to capture souls of those who came into his life path. It wasn't Joe who was in control, but an evil spirit that he had unleashed. It was a strong force, unrestrained by Joe. Joe was a hard-working man, but somewhere in his past, he had been given the Ouija board. He knew, then, he should have buried it. But as soon as he placed his hands on it, it became part of him, and he couldn't break free. It had a hold on him. He was given the dark task of capturing souls by the spirits within. Later that night, Emily and John called in to see how Evelyn was. They wanted to make sure she was well and feeling better. Emily and John had decided to cycle to Evelyn's. John had 2 old mountain bikes in the shed at the back of Smokies. The journey took them around 30 minutes to cycle there. As they got closer, they could see Joe at the door of Evelyn's. He was pleading to Evelyn to let him in. He was carrying a small rucksack on his left shoulder. Emily and John looked at each other. "We need to do something now," Emily said to John. "Whatever happens tonight, we stay together." They leaned their mountain bikes against a nearby tree, their every step towards the ominous log cabin fraught with anticipation. Joe's heart raced, knowing the love he still held for Evelyn was about to be put to the test. Evelyn, with a somber look, opened the door of the log cabin, revealing her troubled emotions. Yet, Compelled by her affection for Joe, she allowed them in. Just as the door was on the verge of closing, Emily and John appeared at the entrance, freezing time for an electrifying moment. Evelyn's eyes ignited with a mix of surprise and apprehension as they gazed at Emily. Unbeknownst to all but Joe, his visit was orchestrated by the enigmatic influence of a box concealed in his rucksack. With deliberate steps, he ventured into the cabin, placing the rucksack on a small table beside the dwindling fire. The box tumbled out, remaining unopened, a harbinger of eerie secrets. It was the Ouija board. Emily and John, uninvited guests in Evelyn's sanctuary, found her standing at the modest kitchen sink. Joe intended to apologize, but Emily and John sensed a darker purpose behind his visit. Emily pivoted to John, her voice trembling with intrigue. She inquired, "How can you lift something without ever touching it?" In a heartbeat, John lunged forward, tipping the table's corner skyward. The rucksack crashed to the floor, and in a surreal, slow-motion dance, the Ouija board slid across the table, heading straight for the crackling fire. Suddenly, it erupted in a blaze of furious and mournful flames. The chain of events unfolded too rapidly for Joe to respond. Overwhelmed by the chaos and dread, tears welled up in his eyes. Evelyn fell to her knees, kneeling on the floor. She was crying, not because of unhappiness but because she had her Joe returned back to her, with hope in her heart. Joe slowly walked over to where Evelyn was. He kneeled down in front of her, and they held each other in each other's arms. Together they whispered the same thing. "I love you." The fire continued to burn, now much lower. Emily turned to John, who was standing near the cabin door. She said to John, "I think we should leave these two alone now." As they both walked out of the log cabin, closing the door behind them and walking back to their mountain bikes, which were against a nearby tree, their every step seemed to be a little lighter, step by step.